In this video I'm going to deconstruct a multiphonic. Multiphonic I'm going to do that to is a very straightforward one. It's basically the low F3 fingering, standard F3 fingering with the addition of the C sharp key. The standard F3 fingering and then also depressing the C sharp key. This is a slightly unusual one from a notational perspective, just in that it's worth noting that the C sharp key, while everything else I'm doing here is covering a hole, all of these fingers when they go down they cover a hole and they block off a tube on the clarinet. The C sharp key, when you press it, is actually opening a hole on the back side there, if you can see that. So it's creating an open hole in the middle. And this is a single fork multiphonic, by which I mean that when you put all the keys of the F down, so that F is a column of air that runs from the hole below the F key, the next open hole, all the way up to the reed. So that pitch is coming from the vibration of that column of air. When you put down the C sharp key, the hole in the middle creates two separate tubes. You have a fork. A fork is where there's now a tube of air, a column of air running from the hole of the C sharp key up to the reed, and another one running from down where the F is. And you'll see how this affects this in a moment. So the multiphonic itself. Quite straightforward one, relatively easy to produce. How do we deconstruct it? Well, first off, the low pitch, let's isolate that. There are two main pitches there and heterodyne components. The two main pitches are the prominent pitches we're hearing, a low one in the shallow range and a higher one up in the clarinet range. And then heterodyne components are essentially synthesis components that happen from the interaction of those two. When it's played quietly, they're not that strong, but you can hear them in the timbre as that slightly electronic-y sound. They're basically combination and difference tones. So to isolate the lower pitch, so altering my embouchure to underblow significantly means you can hear that lower pitch in itself, which is about, it's more or less a B natural transposed. So that's coming from, we can deduce that from, if I play, as I said, the first air column is going from that opening hole where the C sharp key opens up to the reed. That air column there, that's the C sharp. If I add on the remaining fingers of the multiphonic, I'm closing these one by one, you hear how that flattens the C sharp down to more or less a B. You also probably heard that as I put down more fingers, I had to put more work into it in order to keep the pitch stable and stop it overblowing. We'll come back to that in a minute, but that's characteristic sound of the shallow pitch in a multiphonic. It's quite ameliorated, you don't have a lot of higher frequency content to it, and if I try to play it loudly, it'll probably split or overblow. But that's how we derive that, and this is called loading. So you have the original C sharp pitch, where the C sharp pitch is mostly emerging from that hole where the C sharp key opens. And then by adding on these other closed holes, you're creating another section of tube expanding downwards like that. And what that does is it drags down the air column slightly. It's an effect called end correction in acoustics. So that flattens the whole thing. So that's where we get our low pitch from. If I isolate the higher pitch, which is if I play in the clarinet register, that's an A, so it's a slightly flat A. Where that's coming from, if I take away the C sharp entirely and just play the low F tube, as I said earlier, we have a column of air that's running from where the F closes that hole and the next open hole is down here, so that column of air is running all the way from there to the reed. There's a process here going on called venting. Venting is where a hole is opened further upstream of the tube, so the column of air runs from there to there, and the C-sharp key opens up as a vent. And what a vent does, especially if it's a small hole, register key is like a vent. When it's a small hole, it suppresses the fundamental, so that F gets suppressed. We can see this by, very simply, opening the register key. Instantly, as soon as you open the register key, that vent jumps the pitch up a 12th. So you jump up to the next harmonic, which is the third partial of F, which is that C, as soon as you put on the register key. Other fingers, any other hole, can also act as a vent, especially if it's a small hole. So a common technique to stabilize higher pitches, or to reach higher pitches, is to half hole somewhere. So I'm going to just half hole one of these left-hand fingers, just so you hear. You can hear that harmonic A coming out. That's the fifth partial, and that was just obtained from half holing that left 2 finger. If I fully open that, you get a sharper version. So the C-sharp key is basically doing just that. When the C-sharp key is put down and that hole is opened up, the F tube, the F column of air, is vented, so we don't hear that low F, partially as well because it's being pushed out by the low B from the other column. But we don't hear that low F. What does come out, though, is its vented fifth partial, which is flat. And this is presumably flat, not because of loading, because those keys that are down are making that F tube. I think it's flat just because of where the C-sharp hole is. So if I vent other things, you'll hear what I mean. I'm going to vent left hand 1, 2, 3 fingers, and then the C-sharp, which is the hole slightly below those. So you can hear there's a progressive flattening as I move away, as I move down the left hand. Presumably this is because there's a kind of end correction going on in the fifth partial, as the hole of the vent that's being opened up is pulling the fifth partial in some slightly odd ways. At least that's my assumption. But what we get from this is that this multiphonic then is made up of 2 components. A shallow component, which is the B3, which is the C-sharp 4 from that tube, from there to there, that's flattened by loading, adding those other keys, and then a second simultaneous tube, which is originally the F3 tube running from there to there, but because it's vented, the F itself is suppressed, and the energy from that tube goes up into the fifth partial, which is slightly flat because the position of the vent is not exactly where it needs to be to give exactly the fifth partial. Is there anything else in this multiphonic? I think I can probably overblow, and we'll probably get some other components of the F series. You hear that as I start to concentrate on the altissimo register, that it stops being a multiphonic. It's much harder to maintain the 2 together. And this is, as you will have seen earlier, when I vented it from the first left finger, I can get a couple of different harmonics. This is the standard F. So there's the fifth partial and also probably the seventh partial, which, bearing in mind in a clarinet, was going to be much flatter than it normally would. If I go back to the multiphonic, you can hear that even with the multiphonic fingering, what we're really hearing at the top is the fifth and seventh partials of that low F tube, with the venting from the C-sharp allowing them to come out. So the harder I push, the more the vent jumps up a little bit to the next harmonic, but we lose the multiphonic quality of it because it can't balance as much, presumably because in order to push that high, maybe other people could do it, but I'm not able to keep the shallow pitch and the clarinet pitch in balance together. That is a deconstructed multiphonic.